Welcome everyone to Learn at Lunchtime. We're so glad you guys could join us today. We've got a great program we're really looking forward to, but just a couple logistics before we get started. I'm Sherry Trimble, one of the museum educators here at the museum. Right now we're going to bring in Janet Johnson, who is the acting senior curator of archaeology at the State Museum. And she's going to be sharing a program today on the Agnes celebration and some of the archaeological impacts on that.
Thank you, Sherry.
Right.
Welcome, everybody. Well, I think everyone has probably heard a little bit about Agnes at this point. And this is the 50th anniversary of what started out as Hurricane Agnes, and once it arrived in Pennsylvania was Tropical Storm Agnes. It all started with a steady rain in Pennsylvania. And Agnes began as a Category 1 hurricane in Florida with relatively minor damage from the rain. It was a series of tornadoes that claimed the lives of 7 Floridians. This was on Monday, June 19th. By Friday, the wrath of Agnes would be felt by hundreds of thousands who stood in her path. The National Weather Service reported Agnes as a weakening system after making landfall, and as cleanup efforts began, news of Agnes drew little attention further north. A soaking rain was already falling across New York and Pennsylvania from an earlier system, and the focus was on small streams which were nearing capacity. Televisions and newspapers reported on other issues of the day, and Agnes was barely mentioned. There was a lot of political news in the newspapers in 1972. The realization that this was more than just a soaking rain came too late for many who hadn't heard the warnings or hadn't heeded the warnings and had chosen to remain in their homes. By Wednesday, June 21st, the National Weather Service recognized the potential impact as it made its way north into Pennsylvania. And by the end of the day, over 13 inches of rain had fallen in some areas. By Thursday, streams were over their banks across central Pennsylvania and the southern tier of New York, and communities like Corning, Irwin, Painted Post, and Elmira began emergency evacuations. In Pennsylvania, the Susquehanna River was overflowing its banks and towns just over the New York state border. In Bradford County, Sayre, Athens, Towanda, down into Wilkes-Barre, Lock Haven, and of course into Harrisburg, were preparing for severe flooding. Pennsylvania has 4 major river basins, as illustrated on this map. Some of the hardest hit were in the Susquehanna River Basin, but few went unscathed by the storm. Our physiographic landforms, our terrain, is important in recognizing areas prone to flooding. Areas across the northern tier are generally narrow, steep-sided valleys that are prone to flooding, while the Susquehanna lowlands and the Piedmont areas down on the lower half are largely rolling terrain with small streams feeding into the larger rivers such as the Susquehanna. Flood control projects consider these landforms and design and placement of dams, dikes, and flood walls. Try to visualize these landforms as we look at the impact of Agnes on cultural resources within these drainage basins. Cultural resources are many things, but all of them are indicators of human activity and represent our collective past, our heritage. They are churches, schools, museums, cemeteries, historic homes, and landscapes and buried surfaces created by indigenous groups who lived here for thousands of years. A storm like Agnes doesn't discriminate what it chooses to destroy, as we will see in our program today. We will begin in the Susquehanna River Basin in Tioga County and work our way down through the various rivers and valleys. Tioga County borders the New York state line and contains the Tioga River. The Tioga River flows north and joins the Chemung River in New York. Painted Post, Corning, Elmira, and all of the communities surrounding these towns were heavily impacted by flooding. It's all of these areas here. The Chemung River at Corning rose above its flood levels. And of course, the Tioga River, which had flown into the Chemung and flows across the lower half of what we call the southern tier of New York. The Corning Glass Factory is located in Corning, New York, and suffered substantial damage. The Corning Glass Factory is the large smokestack that you can see in the one image. And again, the image on the left, the glassworks is in the back of that image. And all of these communities suffered heavy flooding. Churches were destroyed. The glass that was broken in the exhibit cases was covered with thick layer of mud. Rare books and papers from the library at the Museum of Corning Glass were damaged. And the museum director at the time described the flood as, quote, the greatest single catastrophe borne by an American museum. Thankfully, the fragile objects were cleaned and restored, preserving this cultural resource. Many pre-contact archaeological sites have been recorded in the Chemung and Upper Susquehanna River valleys, and historic documents indicate indigenous groups such as the Munsee, Delaware, Seneca, and Onondaga tribes lived in the valleys in the late 1700s. Flooding in this area washed out pre-contact materials and in some cases deposited soils over sites bearing activity areas under mud and debris. You can see the Penn Central Railroad Bridge here and the railroad cars that collapsed into the river. The Tioga River Valley was authorized for an Army Corps of Engineer flood control project in 1958. But numerous delays prevented completion of the project until 1979, too late to protect the valley from Agnes. I was a teenager living in the area and the steady, persistent rain over a 3-day period seemed to last forever. The small stream near our home turned into a raging forest, pushing logs and debris, but it was minor compared to the towns adjacent to the Tioga River. My father worked in Elmira, New York, and he recalled being released early around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday, June 22nd, as rain was beating down across the region. He had ridden to work with a coworker who had a pickup truck, and when they reached the bridge at Lawrenceville, which crosses the Tioga River, cars were not allowed to pass, but pickup trucks could still get through. They were one of the last vehicles to cross that bridge. Once they were over the Tioga, the remainder of the trip was uneventful and no problems. But that bridge at the Tioga then flooded and made the roads impassable. Damage to his company included flooding and layers of thick mud that would take weeks and months to clean up. Accounts after that time of silt in homes and silt in cabinets and cupboards are frequently discussed. The Tioga River raged through the valley, bringing heavy flooding to Blossburg, Mansfield, and Tioga, and massive flooding in Lawrenceville. Homes were destroyed, businesses were inundated by floodwaters, and without telephone, newspaper, and television, it would take weeks to fully grasp the extent of the flood. Food was in short supply, so communities that had not been impacted shared with others who had lost everything. My grandfather had a van with a high enough chassis that it could pass through areas that were impassable for cars to deliver food to some of those areas. When the newspaper in Elmira was able to resume service, the images were horrific. Survey work completed in anticipation of construction of the dam near Tioga and Lawrenceville in the 1960s identified archaeological sites indicating indigenous peoples lived here from the late Archaic period, approximately 4,850 BP through the late woodland period around 1500 AD. This is a bird's eye view of that river valley before Agnes and, of course, before the construction of the dam. The sites recorded exhibited a shift in the cultural activities from hunting and gathering to spring seasonal fishing and horticulture use in the late woodland period. Very little archaeology had been conducted in this region prior to construction of the dams. This provided an opportunity to learn about settlement patterns in the northern tier. Relocation of residents from the area within the proposed dams was a major undertaking for the Army Corps of Engineers. So much so that an entire village was relocated to higher ground. The historic survey, which was conducted, had recommended that they retain the small village feeling when the relocation was completed. And of course, in order to retain part of that feeling meant moving the church to the higher ground. So the whole community of Nelson was relocated and moved out of the danger of dam construction and impact from filling of the dam. These residents felt fortunate to retain their church, having been moved, and fortunate to have some of their homes moved as well. Homes that had been destroyed were replaced with new homes in similar fashion to what their previous homes had been. This monumental task was viewed as a success by residents, as opposed to the belief from other communities that the compensation offered by state and federal officials was insufficient. The Tioga River and the Canisteo River merge with the Chemung River in New York. It then flows across the southern tier and enters the Susquehanna River just north of Bradford County. Multiple indigenous villages were located along the Susquehanna River in the 18th century and earlier. The destructive swath of raging water and thick mud had disturbed sites previously preserved below ground, which were now exposed. A vocational archaeologists and local collectors scoured the ground, recovering the remains of the past. You can see all of these sites recorded right along the river valley there. Historic documents identify the Sheshequin Path, which ran from the Lycoming Valley, which would be to the lower left side of this image, to the Towanda Creek as an important footpath developed by the tribes of this region and later utilized by settlers. Historic accounts of the Moravian mission of Sheshequin, located at present-day Ulster, Bradford County, recorded evacuation of the village for a few days due to flooding in 1771. The Moravians left the village in 1772 and led a group of followers west to the Allegheny River, including members of the Delaware tribe. The Wyoming Valley was brutally impacted by Agnes. Colleges, libraries, churches, and historical societies were virtually erased from the landscape. This is an aerial view of Wilkes-Barre. The damage was so severe at the river town of 44, Luzerne County, that the earthen dike gave way, destroying a cemetery containing many graves. A stone monument erected later acknowledged the displaced burials estimated at 2,500 graves. The archaeological collection from an investigation at Friedenhutton, a Moravian mission by King's College, a Moravian mission that was being excavated by King's College, was damaged. Artifacts and documentation were tossed about and coated with mud. The archaeology labs were essentially wiped out, and they were never fully restored. The Wyoming County Historical Society benefited from the expertise of the PHMC archive staff after they were inundated with floodwaters and mud. Preservation of these important historic documents was completed in early 1973 so that they could be returned to the Society. The PHMC archives went in and helped remove the documents, took them to a cold storage facility so that they could be kept cold until each page and document was cleaned by archive staff and restored, and then, of course, returned to the Wyoming County Historical Society in 1973. We move now into the Delaware drainage basin, which was also impacted by flooding, and especially at Redding in Berks County. The Schuylkill River went 8 feet over the banks at Redding. Flood control projects that had been constructed prior were credited for lessening the severity of flooding and motivated efforts to construct planned dams such as the Blue Marsh. So the Beltsville or the Francis E. Walter Dam had already been constructed. And again, the Beltsville Lake project was under construction, and Blue Marsh Lake then after Agnes, they constructed the Blue Marsh Lake. And archaeology was done at Blue Marsh before construction, and archaeological sites again recorded in that area. Archaeologists often uncover sites buried under flood deposits. People often believe that an area impacted by flooding no longer contains archaeological information, but this is often not the case. This slide illustrates how deep a deposit might be, preserving human activity under a deep flood deposit. John Milner Associates conducted archaeology in the late 1980s for this Falls Bridge replacement project. And in doing so, they found the foundation of a home that had been wiped off the landscape during Agnes. You can see how deeply buried that foundation is in the lower right corner of this image. Moving west from the Delaware, we are back in the middle and lower Susquehanna River Valley. Again, the cultural resources here are many and was a motivating factor for William Turnbaugh to survey flooded areas in Lycoming and Clinton counties. On June 25th, 1972, just 2 days after the flooded Susquehanna River crested at 34.1 feet in Williamsport, an industrious doctoral archaeology student, William Turnbaugh, watched as the smaller tributaries to the Susquehanna subsided and drained quickly into the river due to the steeply pitched watershed. Turnbaugh noted that erosion of sites was in varying degrees, but was his most common observation. Additional survey work by other archaeologists recorded sites on the west branch of the Susquehanna River, adding to our knowledge of Clemson Island cultures and settlement patterns along this corridor. These are just samples of some of the artifacts that were recovered, some recovered by Turnbaugh and others recovered by other pedestrian survey archaeologists. Moving down the Susquehanna to Harrisburg, capital of Pennsylvania, the lowlands surrounding the capital have experienced numerous floods, but Agnes set new records. With much of the area underwater and thousands of people without shelter, the National Guard was called in to assist residents. Power was out in many areas and factories and businesses were destroyed. The governor's residence was flooded, and when the water receded, a thick layer of mud blanketed the floors. Churches, bridges, and historic properties were all impacted. Fort Hunter Mansion and Park to our north lost structures and land mass in the flooding, washed over and into the river, into the Susquehanna River. 15.25 inches of rain fell on Harrisburg beginning on June 21st. The new gauge height of 32.5 feet broke the 1936 flood record, which was 29.2 feet. The flood control measures taken after the 1936 flood helped prevent even further damage in this region. Historic homes sustained significant damage, with flood levels reaching new levels with rising waters. And the Shipoke neighborhood was nearly destroyed, but most residents who lived there chose to remain and fought to protect their homes and community. Churches came together to help the community, lending shelters, food, and assistance to any and many without a home. Church members rolled up their sleeves in many towns to clean and repair structures so important to their community. As stated earlier, the impact of Agnes was felt across most of the Commonwealth. Few communities had minor damage. Most suffered significant damage. Few had flood insurance, and public officials had little experience dealing with the destruction of Agnes. York and Lancaster counties to the east and south of Harrisburg were impacted. Crops were destroyed in the fields, homes and barns erased from the landscape. This artist's depiction is an interpretation of what they saw and felt in the lower Susquehanna River Valley. And you can see the death and the Noah's Ark reference that's frequently made, and the raindrops, the constant raindrops. Areas west and north of Harrisburg along the Juniata and into the Huntington Valley suffered losses. Historic bridges, homes, and businesses would never be the same. We lost 23 covered bridges that were destroyed by Agnes and never rebuilt. The PHMC owns historic sites across the Commonwealth, including Fort Pitt. It has since been transferred, but during Agnes, it was a fairly new museum constructed in 1969. Efforts of staff and associates saved artifacts and documents from destruction. When the realization that predictions of no impact was incorrect, swift action to load the artifacts and remove them to a secure location was completed due to heroic efforts of the museum staff. Fort Pitt Museum records indicate that when Agnes struck the point, that 45 inches of flood water inundated the building. Flood control projects such as the Ensued Dam aided in reducing the impact of Agnes on small towns and communities north of Pittsburgh, and the Army Corps and other planning agencies point to the Allegheny River Valley's development history as a leading cause of its flooding problems. The more homes and roads and impervious surfaces that are built, more and more water is working its way into the small creeks, and more flooding is occurring. Tropical Storm Agnes left a lasting impact on many aspects of our lives. In the 50 years since Agnes, it is still considered one of the most destructive events to occur across multiple states. 122 people perished, 50 in Pennsylvania alone, over $3 billion of damage. Communities changed, some never fully recovered from the impact of businesses and homes destroyed. The demographics of many neighborhoods changed as older residents chose to leave, and historic towns and homes were torn down and replaced by new structures. The common thread in every story I have heard and read from others or experienced myself as a teen is the importance of community. Someone had a pump, another had a truck. Students home from college and high school all contributed. The coming together in times of mass destruction and need, finding a way to help others who are less fortunate. The high water mark remains as a reminder of what can happen as we see more extreme climate events. The need for preparedness is critical. The National Weather Service and the Emergency Management Service use this and other disasters to consider ways to improve reporting systems to make sure there is sufficient time for evacuation. The Army Corps of Engineers continues to review and refine flood control methods, and museums and historic sites review and develop emergency plans for preserving our past. It is important that we are mindful of their recommendations and evacuate when asked to prevent endangering rescue teams. Our cultural resources are the thread that binds the glue, if you will, to our collective past. Archaeology continues to uncover the past and share our findings and heritage with all. We can examine and learn from the past as a tool for planning and adapting to the future, prepared for whatever Mother Nature decides to bear down on us next. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Yeah, so to remind everybody, we are going to be using the Q&A box, which we do have a couple of questions. So I'm going to start my video. And Janet, if you want to join me, we'll see everybody see their face, and we'll stop sharing our screen. There we go. All right. So first question is an interesting one, and we kind of chatted a little bit earlier about this, but that there was a kind of a resistance initially about building the dams prior to Agnes, and a lot of people, you know, are we getting full market value for our property and things like that? But what kind of flip reaction did we see after that?
Well, again, almost immediately after Agnes, groups were petitioning their representatives to get funding, to have the monies put in place. Of course, there was a lot of federal emergency funding put in place to help with the damages, and construction began very shortly after, so that for instance, the Blue Marsh Lake, I believe construction is completed in like 1979 or 1980. And they moved fairly quickly. Everybody wanted to and saw the benefits of having those dams in place.
Mm-hmm. This is an interesting one. I'm not sure if you know, but so of the Wyoming Historical Society that you had up there earlier, do you know if they were able to recover any Revolutionary War items there?
I'm sorry, I don't know that answer.
Deeper research on that one.
Right. That I don't know that one.
Yeah.
Our state archives might know the answer to that.
Yeah, they did, and just let everybody know that they do have a lot of records of the materials from Agnes. If you're looking for specific areas, because this is broadly about the entire state. Tough to do all in 20 minutes, right? Yeah.
When there's so much. We have such a rich cultural past.
Yeah. This is a flip side versus flood. Now we're seeing change in our climate. We're seeing water a little bit lower than we're typically used to, more drought. Do you or have you seen archaeological sites pop up more recently due to climate change?
We haven't had, you know, you hear these stories of the lakes drying up out in Arizona and, you know, rich deposits being exposed. We haven't had that extreme conditions here yet that we're seeing those types of things. But certainly I know from personal experience, this is a pretty dry summer. And, you know, if we continue with that pattern, I think especially in the Pocono regions and those bogs and marshes that have historically, we've recovered canoes and other preserved remains. I think that we may find some of those things coming to the surface in the future.
All right, somebody else was mentioning State Library is another great resource for looking those items. So keep them in mind.
And National Weather Service has done a terrific job with Agnes at 50. There are several local PBS type videos and things on Agnes. So I encourage everybody to check out those other resources.
So this is kind of, this one's coming from me, but we talk about there's silver linings sometimes that come up from situations as this. What silver lining impact in terms of archaeology came from the result of Agnes?
Well, one of the big things with archaeology is that we want to look at patterns across the landscape. We want to look at movement of especially the indigenous groups of peoples that we don't have a good written record for, and how they settled and how they use tools and resources and things. So in these rural areas, the northern tier especially, there has not been a lot of development in those areas. Like here we have so much development with transportation projects that we've looked at a lot of the lower half of the Commonwealth. And in those rural areas, this gave us an opportunity to actually do some archaeology and recover some important resources. And we demonstrated through a transportation project that was done in the late 90s, that there were village sites along the Susquehanna in those rural areas as well that had not previously been identified.
One question came up, of course, that was quite impactful about the cemetery. You want to tell a little bit more detail about what happened, how they were able to deal with that?
Well, again, the dike broke and the impact of the water rushed into the 40 Fort Cemetery, and coffins floated out. And unfortunately, many of the coffins, were damaged, and they were unable to identify. There was not a forensic archaeologist brought in to identify remains. So they established a mass burial area and put up a historic marker to mark those graves. And 2,400, it was kind of a mixed, I found 2,400 in one site, 2,500 in another site. It demonstrates the importance of being able to map cemeteries and know who's buried in those cemeteries. And of course, in these areas, rural areas, maps and things like that were destroyed, records were destroyed that went along with the cemetery. So it made it even more difficult. And it was one of the things that would pop up in the newspaper periodically, where again, embalmed human remains had been found in such and such in the Tioga River. I know that we had them. And it was very unfortunate, that we didn't have a better mechanism in place for handling testing of those remains to try and identify who those individuals were.
Yeah, very sad. Wow, this has, well, although not necessarily the brightest topic on Agnes, but I think it is important for us to think back and look at our history and the events that took place. I love that you talked about the community aspect of everything. I think when we go through tragedies, COVID and things like that, that bring the community out.
Well, and again, it's community that holds together our cultural heritage and helps to preserve it. I think that's one of the things that we need to learn from our history, is that in order to preserve our heritage, we have to be vested in our community and vested in preserving these types of cultural resources. As I said, it can be a church, it can be a historic home, churches are often a binding factor in many communities. And many of the accounts that I looked at, churches were one of the first things that individuals tried to restore and tried to, you know, they wanted to be able to return to their church. It's a sign of community.
Yeah. Somebody telling us a story about all the great things that they were busloads of Mennonites from Lancaster came into Harrisburg. He was telling us a story about that. That's great. I mean, because some areas weren't impacted, and so but they felt they could come and help other areas.
That's right. Everybody chipped in, and there was no no concern as to, you know, where you were going or who you were helping. It was just, they need our help. We'll send food, we'll send people, we'll send whatever we have.
Well, everybody, this has been a great presentation. Thank you so much, Janet, for joining me today. So everybody have a great weekend.
I'm going to put in a little spot here for following our blog, twipa.blogspot.com. We've been doing a series of blogs on Tropical Storm Agnes. And there will be another one going up early part of next week or midweek. And we'll continue with about 3 more in the series as we cover the rest of the Commonwealth in that series of blogs about. And you'll see, again, a little bit more expanded information than what I was able to provide today.
Great. Awesome.
All righty. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody.